She looked me dead in the eye and said those words that would change everything between us. I'm tired of being just a widow at 42. The way she said it, with that mix of frustration and determination, caught me completely off guard. I thought, she was joking at first. I mean, what do you even say to something like that? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra. Special for you. My name is James, and I never expected to find myself in the middle of someone else's life crisis at a Tuesday night book club meeting in downtown Portland. The whole thing started innocently enough. I'd been going to this little gathering at Morrison's Coffee House for about 6 months, mostly because my therapist said I needed to engage with people after my divorce. Apparently, hiding in my apartment and ordering takeout wasn't considered healthy social interaction. The book club was small, maybe 8 regular members, and we met every other Tuesday to discuss whatever novel someone had picked. That particular evening, we were supposed to talk about some romance novel I hadn't even finished reading. The irony wasn't lost on me, a recently divorced guy struggling through love stories with a group of mostly middle-aged women. That's where I met Rebecca Martinez. She'd been coming to the group for about a year, always sitting in the same corner chair, always contributing thoughtful comments about character development and plot structure. She had this way of analyzing stories that made you see things you'd completely missed. Rebecca was the kind of person who noticed details, the way an author used weather to reflect a character's mood, or how dialogue revealed hidden motivations. What I knew about Rebecca before that Tuesday was limited. She was 42, worked as a graphic designer for a marketing firm downtown, and had been widowed for 3 years. Her husband Michael had died in a car accident when an ice storm hit the city, unexpectedly one February morning. She'd mentioned it once, briefly, when we were discussing a book about grief, and then never brought it up again. Rebecca had this quiet strength about her. She wasn't the type to dominate conversations, but when she spoke, people listened. She had shoulder-length dark hair that she often tucked behind her ear when she was thinking, and these expressive brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. There was something careful about the way she moved through the world, like someone who'd learned not to take anything for granted. The evening started normally enough. We were sitting in our usual circle, coffee cups and water glasses scattered across the small tables Morrison's had pushed together for us. Janet, who basically ran the book club, was trying to get everyone to focus on the discussion questions she'd printed out. But the conversation kept drifting to other topics. Someone's daughter's wedding plans, another person's vacation to Seattle. The usual small talk that happens when you put the same group of people together regularly. I was only half listening, honestly. I'd been having trouble concentrating on much of anything lately. The divorce had been finalized 4 months earlier, and I was still adjusting to this new version of my life. Everything felt temporary, like I was living in someone else's apartment, working at someone else's job, going through motions that belonged to a different person. Rebecca hadn't said much during the first hour of our meeting. She'd made a few comments about the book's pacing and asked one question about the author's use of flashbacks, but mostly she just listened. I'd noticed she seemed more distracted than usual, checking her phone a couple times and glancing toward the window more often than normal. It was when Janet started talking about the book's themes of second chances and new beginnings that something shifted in Rebecca's demeanor. She set down her coffee cup with a little more force than necessary, and I saw her jaw tighten slightly. Janet was going on about how the main character deserved happiness, after all she'd been through. How it was important for people to remain open to love, even after experiencing loss. Sometimes I think these books make it sound too easy, Rebecca said suddenly, interrupting Janet mid-sentence. Everyone turned to look at her, surprised by the edge in her voice. Like grief has an expiration date, and once you've mourned appropriately, you're supposed to be ready to move on to the next chapter. The room got quiet. Janet shuffled her discussion questions nervously. Well, I think the author was trying to show that healing is possible. I'm tired of being just a widow at 42, Rebecca said, her voice getting stronger. She was looking right at me when she said it for some reason. Maybe because I was sitting directly across from her, or maybe because she sensed I might understand something about feeling stuck in an identity you never chose. The words hung in the air between us. I felt like everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting to see how this moment would resolve itself. Rebecca's cheeks had flushed slightly, like she surprised herself by speaking so directly. "You're joking?" I said, though I knew immediately that she wasn't. It was a stupid response, but it came out before I could stop myself. What I meant was that I couldn't believe someone like Rebecca, someone who seemed so together, so purposeful, felt as lost as I did. She shook her head slowly. "I'm not joking, James. I'm tired of people seeing me as Michael's widow before they see me as Rebecca. I'm tired of well-meaning friends trying to set me up with their divorced colleagues because they think I need rescuing. I'm tired of attending social events alone and having people either avoid me because they don't know what to say or hover around me like I might break down at any moment." Her voice had gotten quieter, but somehow more intense. "I'm tired of living in a house that still feels like it belongs to someone else, surrounded by photos and furniture that represent a life that ended 3 years ago. I'm tired of people telling me how strong I am, how well I'm handling everything, when most days I feel like I'm just going through the motions." The honesty in her voice was startling. This wasn't the Rebecca I'd known for 6 months of polite book discussions. This was someone who'd been carrying around thoughts and feelings she hadn't shared with anyone. "I loved Michael," she continued, looking down at her hands now. "I loved him completely, and I still miss him every day. But I'm not just his widow. I'm a person with my own dreams and desires and fears. I'm someone who wants to travel to places we never got to see together. I'm someone who wants to try things that scared me when I was married, because I was afraid of failing in front of someone I loved so much." She looked back up at me. "I'm tired of feeling guilty for wanting more than just memories." I didn't know what to say to that. In 6 months of casual acquaintance, I'd never suspected Rebecca was wrestling with anything more complicated than which book to suggest for our next meeting. But sitting there, listening to her, I realized I'd been making the same mistake everyone else had been making. I'd seen her surface, the composed, thoughtful woman who always had interesting insights about literature, without considering what might be underneath. The rest of the book club meeting passed in a blur. Janet tried to steer the conversation back to the novel, but the energy had shifted completely. People seemed to sense that something significant had happened, even if they weren't sure what to do with it. We wrapped up earlier than usual, with promises to finish the book before next time, and reminders about the upcoming meeting date. As people started gathering their things and saying their goodbyes, Rebecca remained in her corner chair, staring out the window at the streetlights beginning to flicker on in the early autumn darkness. I found myself lingering too, uncertain whether I should say something or just leave her alone with whatever thoughts were running through her mind. Morrison's was starting to close down around us. The barista was wiping down tables and stacking chairs, the subtle hint that it was time for everyone to head home. Most of the other book club members had already left, calling out their goodbyes and see you next times as they headed into the Portland evening. Finally, Rebecca stood up and started putting her book and notebook into her bag. She moved slowly, like someone who wasn't eager to get wherever she was going next. When she looked up and saw me still standing there, she gave me a small, slightly embarrassed smile. "Sorry about that," she said. "I didn't mean to hijack the meeting." "You didn't hijack anything," I told her. "Sometimes these discussions get real. That's not necessarily a bad thing." She slung her bag over her shoulder and headed toward the door. I followed, not because I had any particular plan, but because it seemed wrong to let her walk away alone after sharing something so personal with a room full of relative strangers. Outside, the October air was crisp and carried the smell of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Portland in autumn always felt like the city was settling in for the long, rainy season ahead. Rebecca stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking uncertain about which direction to go, even though I was pretty sure she walked to these meetings and probably knew exactly how to get home. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She nodded. "When you said you were tired of being just a widow at 42, what did you mean by just?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, watching cars pass on the street in front of us. "I meant that somewhere along the way that became my entire identity. Rebecca, Michael's widow. Rebecca, the woman whose husband died. Rebecca, who's been through so much. It's like everything else about me disappeared." She turned to look at me directly. "What about you, James? What are you tired of being?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on her revelation that I hadn't expected her to turn the conversation back to me. But standing there on the sidewalk with the honest way she was looking at me, I found myself answering more truthfully than I'd planned. "I'm tired of being the guy whose wife left him for someone else," I said. "I'm tired of being the cautionary tale about not paying enough attention to your marriage. I'm tired of friends treating me like I'm contagious, like divorce might be something they could catch." Rebecca nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. "We should probably talk about this somewhere that isn't a sidewalk," she said. We ended up at a 24-hour diner called Murphy's about 6 blocks from Morrison's. It was one of those classic American diners with red vinyl booths and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick. But the coffee was decent, and it was the kind of place where you could sit and talk without anyone bothering you. Rebecca slid into the booth across from me and immediately started fidgeting with the sugar packets in the little metal container. Her hands were shaking slightly, and I realized that her confession at the book club had taken more out of her than she'd let on. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I can't believe I said all that in front of Janet," she said, shaking her head. "She's going to spend the next week calling everyone to discuss my emotional breakthrough," I laughed. "Janet means well, but yeah, she's definitely going to turn this into the next meeting's discussion topic." The waitress came over and we ordered coffee. Rebecca asked for pie, which surprised me because I'd never seen her eat anything at the book club meetings except for the occasional cookie. She seemed different here, away from the group, more relaxed despite the intensity of what we'd been talking about. "So how long were you married?" she asked once the waitress left. 12 years. "You?" 8. She paused, then added, "Michael and I were high school sweethearts. We got married when I was 24, right after I finished my graphic design degree. Everyone said we were too young, but we thought we had it all figured out." The coffee arrived, along with a slice of apple pie that Rebecca immediately started cutting into precise, even pieces. It was such a deliberate action that I wondered if it was something she did when she was nervous. This need to create order out of chaos. "What happened with your marriage?" she asked. If you don't mind me asking. I'd been dreading this question for months, but sitting across from Rebecca, it felt easier to answer honestly than it had with anyone else who'd asked. Maybe because she'd been so open with the book club, or maybe because we were both dealing with identities we hadn't chosen. "Her name was Sarah," I said. "She worked at the same accounting firm as me, in a different department. We met at a company Christmas party, started dating, got married 3 years later. Everything seemed normal until about 2 years ago when she started working late more often, going on more business trips." Rebecca nodded, eating her pie slowly while I talked. "I thought she was just ambitious, trying to make a partner. I was proud of her, actually. Then one day she came home and told me she'd been having an affair with someone from her department for 8 months. Said she was in love with him, that she'd felt disconnected from me for years but hadn't known how to talk about it." "Did you try counseling?" "She'd already made up her mind. Moved out 2 weeks later. Married the guy 6 months after our divorce was finalized." I took a sip of coffee, which had already gone lukewarm. The worst part wasn't even the affair. It was realizing that I'd been so focused on work, on paying bills, on all the practical stuff, that I'd stopped noticing she was unhappy. Rebecca set down her fork. "You can't blame yourself for someone else's decision to have an affair instead of communicating with you. Rationally, I know that. But it's hard not to wonder what would have happened if I'd paid more attention. If I'd asked the right questions." "Michael and I never had those problems," Rebecca said quietly. "We communicated about everything. Maybe too much sometimes. He knew what I was thinking before I said it, and vice versa. When he died, it felt like losing half of myself." She looked out the diner window at the empty parking lot. "People kept telling me that the intense grief would fade, that I'd learn to live with it. And they were right, in a way. The sharp, constant pain did ease up. But what they didn't tell me was that when the grief became manageable, I'd be left with this question of who I was supposed to be now." "What do you mean?" "Michael and I were a unit. We made decisions together, planned our future together, even had the same friend groups. When he died, I inherited this whole life that was built for 2 people. His parents still call me on holidays. expecting me to carry on traditions that were really his traditions. Our mutual friends invite me to things, but I can tell they don't know how to act around me anymore. She picked up her coffee cup but didn't drink from it. And God, dating at 42 after being widowed is like navigating some bizarre social minefield. Men either treat me like I'm fragile and damaged, or they act like I should be grateful for any attention because I'm used goods or something. Have you been dating much? I tried. My sister set me up with her husband's cousin last year. Nice guy, divorced, 2 kids. We went to dinner, and he spent the entire time comparing his ex-wife to Michael, like we were in some kind of support group for people whose previous relationships ended badly. Rebecca finally took a sip of her coffee and made a face. This is terrible coffee. It really is, I agreed, but neither of us made a move to leave. Then there was the guy I met at a work conference. He seemed normal and asked me out for drinks. Halfway through the evening, he starts asking really specific questions about Michael's death, like he was morbidly curious about the details of the accident. I realized he was more interested in my tragic backstory than in actually getting to know me. I winced. That's awful. The thing is, I do want to meet someone eventually. I want companionship, maybe even love again. But I want someone to see me as Rebecca first, not as the widow who might be ready to move on. I want someone who's interested in my thoughts about art and books and travel, not someone who thinks my grief makes me either untouchable or incredibly profound. She paused, looking directly at me. What about you? Have you tried dating? A few times. Mostly disasters. I thought about the awkward coffee dates, the woman who spent an hour telling me about her own divorce, the one who seemed to think I needed a mother figure more than a partner. I think I'm still figuring out who I am outside of being married. Sarah and I were together for so long that I'm not sure what my preferences are anymore, separate from hers. Like what? Stupid things, mostly. What kind of movies I actually like when I'm not trying to compromise with someone else's taste. Whether I want to live in the city or move somewhere quieter. What I want to do with my free time. I realized, as I was talking, that these weren't stupid things at all. I spent 12 years being half of a couple, and now I have to learn how to be a whole person on my own. Rebecca nodded emphatically. Yes, exactly. Except in my case, Michael and I agreed on almost everything, so I never had to figure out what I wanted when we disagreed. Now I'm 42, and I don't know if I like classical music because I genuinely enjoy it, or because Michael loved it, and I learned to appreciate it through him. Have you made any discoveries about yourself? A few. I found out I actually hate camping, which was a relief because Michael wanted to go every summer and I always said yes. I discovered I like spicy food, which we never ate because it bothered his stomach. And I learned that I'm terrible at making decisions about big purchases because I'm used to talking everything through with someone else first. She smiled for the first time since we'd sat down. Last month I spent 3 hours at the furniture store trying to decide on a new couch because I kept thinking, what would Michael think? Then I realized Michael was never going to see this couch, and I could buy whatever I wanted. What kind did you get? A bright blue sectional that takes up way too much space in my living room. Michael would have hated it, but I love it. The diner was almost empty now except for us and a couple of truckers at the counter. The waitress had stopped refilling our coffee cups, another subtle hint that our time was running out. Can I ask you something? Rebecca said. Sure. When you said I was joking earlier, what did you mean? Did you really think I was making some kind of joke about being tired of widowhood? I felt my face get warm. No. I knew you weren't joking. I think I was just surprised to hear someone else express something I'd been feeling but couldn't put into words. Which was? Being tired of living inside a story someone else wrote about you. In your case, the tragic widow. In my case, the guy whose wife left him. I met her eyes across the table. I guess I said you were joking because I couldn't believe someone like you felt as stuck as I did. Someone like me? You always seem so composed at the book club, like you've got everything figured out. Rebecca laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. I've gotten very good at appearing composed. 3 years of practice. We ended up at a 24-hour diner called Murphy's about 6 blocks from Morrison's. It was one of those classic American diners with red vinyl booths and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick, But the coffee was decent, and it was the kind of place where you could sit and talk without anyone bothering you. Rebecca slid into the booth across from me and immediately started fidgeting with the sugar packets in the little metal container. Her hands were shaking slightly, and I realized that her confession at the book club had taken more out of her than she'd let on. "I can't believe I said all that in front of Janet," she said, shaking her head. "She's going to spend the next week calling everyone to discuss my emotional breakthrough." I laughed. "Janet means well, but yeah, she's definitely going to turn this into next meeting's discussion topic." The waitress came over and we ordered coffee. Rebecca asked for pie, which surprised me because I'd never seen her eat anything at the book club meetings except for the occasional cookie. She seemed different here, away from the group, more relaxed despite the intensity of what we'd been talking about. "So, how long were you married?" she asked once the waitress left. 12 years. "You?" 8. She paused, then added, "Michael and I were high school sweethearts. We got married when I was 24, right after I finished my graphic design degree. Everyone said we were too young, but we thought we had it all figured out." The coffee arrived, along with a slice of apple pie that Rebecca immediately started cutting into precise, even pieces. It was such a deliberate action that I wondered if it was something she did when she was nervous. This need to create order out of chaos. "What happened with your marriage?" she asked. "If you don't mind me asking." I'd been dreading this question for months, but sitting across from Rebecca, it felt easier to answer honestly than it had with anyone else who'd asked. Maybe because she'd been so open with the book club, or maybe because we were both dealing with identities we hadn't chosen. "Her name was Sarah," I said. "She worked at the same accounting firm as me, in a different department. We met at a company Christmas party, started dating, got married 3 years later. Everything seemed normal until about 2 years ago when she started working late more often, going on more business trips." Rebecca nodded, eating her pie slowly while I talked. "I thought she was just ambitious, trying to make a partner. I was proud of her, actually. Then one day she came home and told me she'd been having an affair with someone from her department for 8 months. Said she was in love with him, that she'd felt disconnected from me for years, but hadn't known how to talk about it. Did you try counseling?" She'd already made up her mind. Moved out 2 weeks later, married the guy 6 months after our divorce was finalized. I took a sip of coffee, which had already gone lukewarm. The worst part wasn't even the affair. It was realizing that I'd been so focused on work, on paying bills, on all the practical stuff, that I'd stopped noticing she was unhappy. Rebecca set down her fork. "You can't blame yourself for someone else's decision to have an affair instead of communicating with you. Rationally, I know that. But it's hard not to wonder what would have happened if I'd paid more attention. If I'd asked the right questions." "Michael and I never had those problems," Rebecca said quietly. "We communicated about everything, maybe too much sometimes. He knew what I was thinking before I said it, and vice versa. When he died, it felt like losing half of myself." She looked out the diner window at the empty parking lot. "People kept telling me that the intense grief would fade, that I'd learn to live with it. And they were right in a way. The sharp, constant pain did ease up. But what they didn't tell me was that when the grief became manageable, I'd be left with this question of who I was supposed to be now." "What do you mean?" "Michael and I were a unit. We made decisions together, planned our future together, even had the same friend groups. When he died, I inherited this whole life that was built for 2 people. His parents still call me on holidays, expecting me to carry on traditions that were really his traditions. Our mutual friends invite me to things, but I can tell they don't know how to act around me anymore." She picked up her coffee cup, but didn't drink from it. "And dating. God, dating at 42 after being widowed is like navigating some bizarre, social minefield. Men either treat me like I'm fragile and damaged, or they act like I should be grateful for any attention because I'm used goods or something." "Have you been dating much?" I tried. "My sister set me up with her husband's cousin last year. Nice guy, divorced, 2 kids. We went to dinner, and he spent the entire time comparing his ex-wife to Michael, like we were in some kind of support group for people whose previous relationships ended badly." Rebecca finally took a sip of her coffee and made a face. "This is terrible coffee." "It really is," I agreed, but neither of us made a move to leave. Then there was the guy I met at a work conference. He seemed normal, asked me out for drinks. Halfway through the evening, he starts asking really specific questions about Michael's death, like he was morbidly curious about the details of the accident. I realized he was more interested in my tragic backstory than in actually getting to know me. I winced. That's awful. The thing is, I do want to meet someone eventually. I want companionship, maybe even love again. But I want someone to see me as Rebecca first, not as the widow who might be ready to move on. I want someone who's interested in my thoughts about art and books and travel, not someone who thinks my grief makes me either untouchable or incredibly profound. She paused, looking directly at me. What about you? Have you tried dating? A few times, mostly disasters. I thought about the awkward coffee dates, the woman who spent an hour telling me about her own divorce, the one who seemed to think I needed a mother figure more than a partner. I think I'm still figuring out who I am outside of being married. Sarah and I were together for so long that I'm not sure what my preferences are anymore. Separate from hers. Like what? Stupid things mostly. What kind of movies I actually like when I'm not trying to compromise with someone else's taste. Whether I want to live in the city or move somewhere quieter. What I want to do with my free time. I realized, as I was talking, that these weren't stupid things at all. I spent 12 years being half of a couple, and now I have to learn how to be a whole person on my own. Rebecca nodded emphatically. Yes, exactly. Except in my case, Michael and I agreed on almost everything, so I never had to figure out what I wanted when we disagreed. Now I'm 42, and I don't know if I like classical music because I genuinely enjoy it, or because Michael loved it and I learned to appreciate it through him. Have you made any discoveries about yourself? A few. I found out I actually hate camping, which was a relief because Michael wanted to go every summer and I always said yes. I discovered I like spicy food, which we never ate because it bothered his stomach. And I learned that I'm terrible at making decisions about big purchases because I'm used to talking everything through with someone else first. She smiled for the first time since we'd sat down. Last month I spent 3 hours at the furniture store trying to decide on a new couch, because I kept thinking, what would Michael think? And then I realized Michael was never going to see this couch, and I could buy whatever I wanted. What kind did you get? A bright blue sectional that takes up way too much space in my living room. Michael would have hated it, but I love it. The Yas diner was almost empty now except for us and a couple of truckers at the counter. The waitress had stopped refilling our coffee cups, another subtle hint that our time was running out. Can I ask you something? Rebecca said. Sure. When you said, I was joking earlier, what did you mean? Did you really think I was making some kind of joke about being tired of widowhood? I felt my face get warm. No, I knew you weren't joking. I think I was just surprised to hear someone else express something I'd been feeling but couldn't put into words, which was being tired of living inside a story someone else wrote about you. In your case, the tragic widow. In my case, the guy whose wife left him. I met her eyes across the table. I guess I said you were joking because I couldn't believe someone like you felt as stuck as I did. Someone like me? You always seem so composed at the book club, like you've got everything figured out. Rebecca laughed. But it wasn't a happy sound. I've gotten very good at appearing composed. 3 years of practice. The fluorescent light above our booth flickered, casting strange shadows across the table. Rebecca started organizing the sugar packets again, this time arranging them by color, white, pink, yellow, brown. You want to know what I was really thinking during those book club meetings? She asked. I was thinking about how all these romance novels make it seem so simple. Woman meets man, they overcome some obstacle, they fall in love, happily ever after. But what happens to the characters who already had their happily ever after and lost it? What do you mean? I mean the books we read never seem to be about people like me. They're about women finding love for the first time, or women getting second chances after bad relationships. But what about women who had great relationships that ended through no fault of anyone involved? What about women who have to figure out how to want something different from what they already had and lost? She pushed the sugar packets aside and leaned forward. Michael wasn't a mistake I needed to recover from. He wasn't a learning experience that prepared me for someone better. He was the love of my life, and he's gone. And somehow I'm supposed to figure out how to be open to loving someone else without betraying his memory or comparing every new person to him. Do you feel like you'd be betraying his memory? Sometimes. Not because Michael would have wanted me to stay alone. He actually made me promise I'd try to find happiness again if something happened to him. But because loving someone new feels like admitting that what I had with Michael wasn't enough, wasn't complete somehow. She picked up a napkin and started tearing it into small pieces. And then there's the practical stuff nobody talks about. Like, do I keep wearing my wedding ring? Do I keep Michael's pictures up when I start dating someone? What do I do with all his things that I can't bear to get rid of but that make my house feel like a shrine? What have you done with his things? Most of them are still exactly where he left them. His coffee mug is still in the kitchen cabinet. His books are still on his side of the bookshelf. His clothes are still in the closet. She looked embarrassed. I know it sounds crazy, but changing those things feels so final. It doesn't sound crazy. My sister thinks it is. She's been suggesting for 2 years that I should redecorate and make the space my own. She means well, but she doesn't understand that I'm not ready to erase the evidence that Michael existed, that we had a life together. Rebecca finished, shredding the napkin and started gathering up the pieces. But at the same time, I can't move forward while I'm living in a museum of my marriage. It's like I'm trapped between honoring the past and embracing the future, and I don't know how to do both. Have you talked to anyone about this? A counselor or therapist? I tried grief counseling for about 6 months after Michael died. It helped with the immediate crisis. But now I think I need something different. I need someone to help me figure out how to rebuild my identity, not just process my loss. She looked around the diner, taking in the faded photographs on the walls, the worn linoleum floor, the tired-looking waitress refilling coffee for the truckers. You know what's funny? This is the first real conversation I've had in months, maybe years. Even with my closest friends, we end up talking about safe topics. Work, the weather, books, their kids. Nobody asks me how I'm really doing, and I don't volunteer the information. Why not? Because I think people expect me to be better by now. 3 years is a long time to grieve, according to social conventions. People were very patient and supportive the first year, pretty understanding the second year, but by year 3, there's this subtle pressure to have moved on. She met my eyes. But here's what I've learned. Grief doesn't follow a timeline. It's not like recovering from surgery where you can mark your progress day by day. Some days I feel strong and ready to take on the world, and other days I find one of Michael's old t-shirts and I'm right back to crying in the laundry room. Do you think you'll ever feel ready to date seriously? I don't know. I think I need to figure out who I am now before I can figure out who I want to be with. And that's terrifying because I've never been alone as an adult. I went from living with my parents to living with college roommates to living with Michael. She pushed her empty pie plate to the side. What about you? Do you think you'll try marriage again? The idea scares me, I admitted. Not because I don't want companionship, but because I don't trust my judgment anymore. I thought Sarah and I were happy, but apparently I was the only one who felt that way. How do you know if you're actually compatible with someone, or if you're just good at ignoring problems? Maybe that's something we both need to learn, Rebecca said. How to be complete people on our own before we try to be part of a couple. Again. The diner's cook had turned off the grill, and the smell of cleaning solution was starting to overpower the lingering scent of coffee and fried food. The truckers at the counter were finishing up their meals, getting ready to head back, out onto the highway. I should probably get going, Rebecca said, but she made no move to get up. I have an early client meeting tomorrow. What kind of design work do you do? Mostly marketing materials for small businesses. Logos, brochures, website graphics. It's not particularly creative, but it pays the bills and lets me work from home most of the time. Do you enjoy it? I used to. Michael was always encouraging me to freelance full-time, said I was talented enough to build my own client base. But after he died, I needed the security of a steady paycheck and benefits. Now I'm wondering if I've gotten too comfortable with playing it safe. She finally stood up, reaching for her purse. This was nice, James. I mean, the conversation, not the terrible coffee. Yeah, it was. I pulled out my wallet to pay for our coffee and her pie. Maybe we could do this again sometime. Continue the conversation. Rebecca paused, considering. I'd like that. But I should probably warn you, I'm not looking for anything romantic. I'm barely ready for friendship at this point. That's fine. I'm not looking for anything romantic either. But it would be nice to have someone to talk to who understands what it's like to feel stuck between who you used to be and who you're supposed to become. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Yeah, it would be nice. 3 weeks passed before I saw Rebecca again. The next book club meeting came and went, but she didn't show up. Janet made several pointed comments about how some people were clearly going through difficult transitions and needed space to process their emotions. I wanted to text Rebecca to check if she was okay, but I realized I didn't have her phone number. We'd talked for hours at Murphy's, but we'd never exchanged contact information. I found myself thinking about our conversation more than I expected. Not in a romantic way. We'd both been clear that wasn't what either of us was looking for. But because talking to her had stirred up thoughts I'd been avoiding. The whole question of who I was outside of my failed marriage, what I actually wanted from life now that I was starting over at 38. Work became a welcome distraction. I'd been putting in longer hours anyway since the divorce, partly because I needed the overtime pay, and partly because going home to my empty apartment felt depressing. I was a senior accountant at Henderson & Associates, the same firm where I'd met Sarah, though I'd switched departments after she left to avoid the awkwardness of running into her and her new husband in the hallway. My colleague David Chen had been trying to get me to join him for after-work activities for months. David was one of those naturally social people who seemed to know everyone in the city and was always organizing group outings, hiking trips, brewery tours, trivia nights at various bars around Portland. Before my divorce, I'd always declined these invitations, using Sarah and domestic responsibilities as an excuse. Now I just declined out of habit and a general lack of enthusiasm for forced social interactions. But the Tuesday after the missed book club meeting, David stopped by my desk around 5 o'clock with a different kind of proposal. "There's an art gallery opening downtown this Friday," he said, setting a colorful postcard on my desk. "Local artists, wine and cheese, very low-key. You should come with me." I picked up the postcard. The gallery was called Meridian Arts, and the opening was for an exhibition called Transitions, featuring work by Pacific Northwest artists exploring themes of change and renewal. The timing felt weirdly appropriate. "I don't really know anything about art," I said. "Neither do I," David replied. "That's not the point. The point is getting out of your apartment and doing something different. Plus, free wine." I was about to give my usual polite refusal when something made me reconsider. Maybe it was the conversation with Rebecca about needing to figure out who I was outside of my old identity. Maybe it was realizing that I'd been saying no to everything for months, and it hadn't made me any happier. "Okay," I said. "Why not?" David looked genuinely surprised. "Really? Great. I'll pick you up at 7. Friday evening arrived gray and drizzly, typical October weather in Portland. David showed up at my apartment building right on time, driving his ancient Honda Civic that somehow always smelled like coffee and wet dog despite the fact that he didn't own a dog. "You clean up nice," he said as I got into the passenger seat. I'd made an effort to dress better than my usual work clothes, settling on dark jeans and a button-down shirt that Sarah had bought me for Christmas 2 years ago. It felt strange, wearing something she'd chosen, but most of my wardrobe still reflected her taste since I'd never paid much attention to clothes. The gallery was in the Pearl District, occupying the ground floor of a converted warehouse. Large windows faced the street, and we could see people inside holding wine glasses and moving slowly from painting to painting. The whole scene looked sophisticated and intimidating. "What if we don't fit in?" I asked as we found a parking spot. "Then, we drink their wine and leave," David said. "Worst case scenario, you waste 2 hours of your life. Best case scenario, you discover you're secretly passionate about contemporary art." The gallery was more crowded than I'd expected, filled with people ranging from college-aged hipsters to well-dressed older couples. Jazz music played softly in the background, just loud enough to create ambiance without interfering with conversation. The artwork covered a wide range of styles and mediums: abstract paintings, photography, sculpture, mixed media installations. David and I grabbed glasses of wine from a table near the entrance and started wandering through the space. I felt self-conscious at first, unsure how long you were supposed to look at each piece or what you were supposed to think about them. But after a few minutes, I found myself genuinely interested in some of the work. There was a series of photographs documenting the demolition and rebuilding of a neighborhood in southeast Portland. Another artist had created sculptures from materials salvaged from demolished houses: broken tile, weathered wood, old doorknobs, transforming discarded objects into something beautiful and new. I was studying a painting that seemed to show the same landscape in different seasons when I heard a familiar voice behind me. That's by Maria Santos. She's a local artist who specializes in temporal landscapes. I turned around to find Rebecca standing there, holding a glass of white wine, and looking more put together than I'd ever seen her. She was wearing a black dress and had done something different with her hair, pulling it back in a way that emphasized her cheekbones. "Rebecca," I said, probably with more enthusiasm than the situation warranted. "I didn't expect to see you here. I work with Maria sometimes," she explained. "My design firm has done marketing materials for several shows at this gallery. When I heard about this exhibition, I thought it might be interesting to see in person." David appeared at my elbow, clearly curious about this unexpected encounter. I introduced them, explaining that Rebecca and I knew each other from the book club. "James was just telling me he doesn't know anything about art," David said to Rebecca. "That's not true," Rebecca replied, looking back at the painting I'd been examining. "You were looking at this piece for several minutes, which suggests it was speaking to you somehow. What drew you to it?" I felt put on the spot, but Rebecca's tone was genuinely curious rather than condescending. "I guess I was thinking about how the same place can look completely different depending on when you see it. Like this tree in the painting. In spring it's full of blossoms, in winter it's bare branches, but it's still the same tree." "That's exactly what Maria was exploring," Rebecca said. "The idea that transformation doesn't mean becoming something entirely different. Sometimes it means revealing different aspects of what was already there." We spent the next hour moving through the gallery together, with Rebecca providing context about the artists and their techniques. She had a way of talking about art that made it accessible without dumbing it down, pointing out details I never would have noticed on my own. David seemed to be enjoying himself too, asking questions and making observations that were surprisingly insightful for someone who claimed to know nothing about art. At one point, he excused himself to get another glass of wine and struck up a conversation with a woman near the sculpture installation, leaving Rebecca and me alone. "This is different from how I usually spend Friday nights," I admitted, as we stood in front of a large abstract painting that looked like a storm viewed from space. "What do you usually do? Order takeout? Watch Netflix? Maybe read if I'm feeling ambitious. You?" "Pretty much the same. Except I usually fall asleep on the couch and wake up at 2 in the morning with the TV still on." She smiled ruefully. "I keep meaning to establish better routines, but it's hard to motivate yourself to cook dinner for one or make plans when you don't have anyone to make them with." "I've been thinking about what you said at the diner," I said. "About needing to figure out who you are before you can figure out who you want to be with. And I realized I've been using my divorce as an excuse not to do things. Like David's been inviting me to stuff for months, and I kept saying no because I told myself I wasn't ready for social situations. But really, I think I was just scared of finding out I'm boring," Rebecca laughed. "Are you bored?" "I don't know. That's the problem. Sarah used to handle our social calendar, choose our entertainment, and decide where we went on vacation. I just went along with whatever she suggested. Now I have to make those decisions myself, and I'm not sure what I actually like. What did you think of tonight?" I looked around the gallery, taking in the artwork, the conversations happening around us, the energy of people discovering something new. I liked it more than I expected. I don't understand everything I'm looking at, but there's something exciting about being surrounded by all this creativity. That's not boring at all. We were interrupted by David returning with 3 fresh glasses of wine. "Sorry, the line was longer than expected, but I had an interesting conversation with that sculptor over there. Apparently she creates all her pieces using only materials she finds within a 1-mile radius of her studio." "That's fascinating," Rebecca said. "It's like creating constraints that force you to be more creative." "Exactly what I was thinking," David said, though I suspected he was mostly pleased that Rebecca found his observation interesting. The gallery was starting to thin out as people headed to dinner or other Friday night activities. David checked his watch and announced that he'd promised to meet some friends at a bar across town. "You're welcome to come," he said to both of us, "but I understand if you want to do your own thing." I looked at Rebecca, wondering if she had other plans, or if she'd want to extend the evening. The gallery opening had been more enjoyable than I'd anticipated, partly because of the art, but mostly because of the company. "There's a coffee shop around the corner that stays open late," Rebecca said. "If you want to continue our conversation from the other night." "I'd like that," I said. David grinned and headed off to meet his friends, leaving Rebecca and me to walk the few blocks to the coffee shop she'd mentioned. The October air was crisp and clean after the earlier rain, and the streets were busy with people heading to restaurants and bars for their Friday night plans. The coffee shop was called Roasters, and it had the kind of comfortable, lived-in atmosphere that made you want to settle in for hours. We found a table by the window and ordered coffee, though it was probably too late in the evening for caffeine. "So, what did you think of your first art gallery opening?" Rebecca asked. "Overwhelming in a good way." I kept feeling like I should have more sophisticated things to say about the artwork, but I also realized that having a genuine reaction to something might be more important than having the right vocabulary to describe it. "Michael used to say that art criticism was just people trying to intellectualize emotional responses," Rebecca said. "He thought the best way to experience art was to pay attention to how it made you feel, not what you thought you were supposed to think about it." It was the first time she'd mentioned Michael in a casual, fond way, rather than in the context of grief or loss. I noticed the shift and wondered if it was significant. He sounds like he was a thoughtful person. He was. He had this way of cutting through pretension and getting to the heart of things. I miss that about him. Having someone around who could help me see when I was overcomplicating something. She stirred sugar into her coffee, looking thoughtful. "But I'm starting to realize that I can develop that skill myself. Tonight, for instance, when you were looking at Maria's painting, you didn't need anyone to tell you what it meant. You understood it intuitively. Maybe. Or maybe I was just projecting my own stuff onto it. Isn't that what art is supposed to do? Make us think about our own experiences in new ways?" We talked until the coffee shop started closing down around us, covering everything from the artwork we'd seen to books we'd read to places we'd traveled or wanted to travel. It was the kind of wide-ranging conversation that felt natural and unforced, the kind I realized I hadn't had in a long time. When we finally left the coffee shop, Rebecca offered to give me a ride back to my apartment since David had been my transportation to the gallery. Her car was a practical Honda sedan, clean and well-maintained, with a stack of design portfolios in the back seat and a travel mug in the cup holder. "Thank you for tonight," I said as she pulled up in front of my building. "I mean, for explaining the art, for the coffee, for the conversation. It was exactly what I needed without knowing I needed it." I had a good time too. It felt nice to talk about Michael in a normal way, not just in the context of missing him. Is that progress? I think so. Or at least it's different, which might be the same thing. I was about to get out of the car when Rebecca spoke again. "James? Would you like to have dinner sometime? As friends, I mean. I'm not ready for anything else, but I think I might be ready for friendship." "I'd like that very much," I said. First dinner as friends happened the following Thursday at a Vietnamese restaurant in southeast Portland that Rebecca had discovered through a design client. The place was small and unpretentious, with mismatched tables and the kind of authentic atmosphere that made you feel like you'd stumbled onto something special. "I've been wanting to try this place for months," Rebecca said as we settled into a corner table. "But eating alone at restaurants still feels awkward to me. I end up ordering takeout instead, which defeats the purpose of exploring new places." "I do the same thing," I admitted. "There's something about sitting alone at a restaurant that feels like advertising your solitude to everyone around you." We ordered spring rolls and pho, and Rebecca asked about my week. I told her about a particularly frustrating client who kept changing their mind about their quarterly reports, and she shared a story about designing a logo for a bakery owner who insisted on Comic Sans font despite all professional advice to the contrary. "Sometimes I think graphic design is 50% actual design work and 50% client psychology," she said, twirling noodles around her chopsticks with practiced ease. "You have to figure out how to give people what they need while making them think they're getting what they want. That sounds exhausting." "It can be. But it's also taught me a lot about communication and compromise. Skills that probably would have served me well in my marriage if I'd developed them earlier. She paused, realizing what she'd said. Sorry, I don't mean to keep bringing up Michael. I'm still learning how to have conversations that aren't centered around grief. You don't have to apologize for mentioning him. He was a huge part of your life. It would be weird if you never talked about him. Rebecca looked relieved. Sarah was a big part of your life too, but you don't mention her very often. Because thinking about Sarah makes me angry, and thinking about Michael makes you sad. Different emotional territories, I guess. Are you still angry? I considered the question while eating a spring roll. Less angry than I was 6 months ago. More confused, maybe. I keep going back and forth between blaming her for not communicating her unhappiness and blaming myself for not noticing it. What if you stopped trying to assign blame altogether? What do you mean? I mean, what if the marriage just ran its course? What if you were both good people who grew apart without anyone being the villain? The idea felt foreign to me. For months, I'd been operating under the assumption that someone had to be at fault, either Sarah for having the affair, or me for being an inattentive husband. The possibility that we'd simply become incompatible over time without anyone doing anything specifically wrong seemed almost too simple. I guess I've been thinking that if I could figure out what went wrong, I could avoid making the same mistakes in the future. But what if there weren't any mistakes? What if there were just two people who wanted different things and took too long to admit it? Rebecca finished her soup and pushed the bowl aside. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, actually, about the difference between relationships that end because of problems and relationships that end because of circumstances. Michael's death was definitely circumstances. Right. Which means I don't have the luxury of analyzing what went wrong or how I could have done things differently. Our relationship didn't fail. It was interrupted. And that creates a completely different set of challenges for moving forward. She looked out the restaurant window at the people walking by on the sidewalk. Sometimes I think it would be easier if Michael and I had gotten divorced. At least then, I'd have clear reasons why it didn't work out. Things I'd want to do differently next time. Instead, you have to figure out how to want something different from what you had. Exactly. And I'm not sure I do want something different. What Michael and I had was good, really good. So how do I open myself up to the possibility of loving someone else without constantly comparing them to him? It was a question I couldn't answer, but I appreciated that she'd shared it with me. We'd moved beyond small talk into the kind of honest conversation that felt both intimate and comfortable. After dinner, we walked around the neighborhood for a while, looking at the eclectic mix of shops and cafes that gave this part of Portland its character. Rebecca pointed out interesting architectural details and told me about the history of the area, how it had transformed from an industrial district to an arts community over the past decade. I love how cities evolve, she said, as we paused in front of a mural that covered the entire side of a building. The way old spaces get repurposed for new uses, how neighborhoods change character while still maintaining some connection to their past. Is that what you're trying to do? Repurpose your old life for new uses? She smiled. That's probably the most accurate metaphor anyone's used to describe what I'm going through. Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm trying to do. We ended up at a bookstore that stayed open late, browsing the shelves and recommending titles to each other. Rebecca gravitated toward art books and literary fiction, while I found myself in the science and history sections. It felt natural and easy, the kind of low-key activity that didn't require constant conversation but provided plenty of opportunities for it. I should probably head home, Rebecca said around 9 o'clock. Early meeting tomorrow with a client who wants to rebrand their entire business but doesn't want to spend money on it. The Comic Sans bakery owner? Different client, same level of unrealistic expectations. I walked her to her car, and we stood there for a moment in the comfortable awkwardness of ending an evening that had gone well. This was nice, she said. Normal. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have dinner with someone and just talk about regular life stuff. We should do it again soon. I'd like that. Maybe next time we can try that Thai place near your apartment. Over the next month, our friendship developed a comfortable rhythm. We'd meet for dinner once or twice a week, usually trying a new restaurant or revisiting places we'd enjoyed. Sometimes we'd go to movies, art galleries, or bookstores. Sometimes we'd just sit in coffee shops and talk. Rebecca was easy company in a way I hadn't expected. She was curious about everything: architecture, food, people watching, current events, and she had a way of asking questions that made me think about familiar topics from new angles. She also had a dry sense of humor that caught me off guard sometimes, making observations about the world around us that were both funny and insightful. Our conversations gradually became more personal without ever feeling forced or therapy-like. She told me about her complicated relationship with her sister, who meant well but had strong opinions about how Rebecca should be handling her widowhood. I shared stories about my parents, who had been divorced for over a decade, but still called each other during family crises. "Do you think they regret getting divorced?" Rebecca asked one evening as we shared dessert at a French bistro. "I don't think so. They're much happier apart than they ever were together. But they're also better at being friends now than they were at being married. That gives me hope." "For what?" "That it's possible to love someone, lose them, and still have that experience contribute something positive to your life. That grief doesn't have to be the final word on a relationship." I was starting to understand that Rebecca's healing process was different from mine in fundamental ways. While I was trying to rebuild my sense of self after a relationship that had failed, she was trying to figure out how to honor a relationship that had succeeded while still remaining open to future possibilities. One evening in late November, we were having dinner at a small Italian place when Rebecca brought up something that had been bothering her. "I've been thinking about what you said that first night at Murphy's," she said, twirling pasta around her fork. "About being tired of living inside a story someone else wrote about you." "What about it?" "I think I've been doing that to myself, writing my own story as the grieving widow who's too loyal to her dead husband to move on with her life." She set down her fork and looked at me directly. "But what if that's not actually who I am? What if I'm someone who loved deeply, lost someone important, and is now figuring out how to love again in a different way?" That sounds like a better story. It does, doesn't it? But it's also scarier, because it means I have to take responsibility for my own happiness, instead of just accepting that my happy ending already happened and ended. We were interrupted by the waiter asking if we wanted more wine. Rebecca declined, but I could tell she had more to say. "I've been seeing a new therapist," she said after the waiter left. "Someone who specializes in helping people navigate major life transitions rather than just processing grief." "How's that going?" "Differently than I expected. She's been asking me questions I haven't thought about, like what kind of life I want to build now, what my goals and dreams are independent of Michael's memory." Rebecca picked up her wine glass but didn't drink from it. "And I realized I don't know how to answer those questions. I know what Michael and I wanted together, but I don't know what I want alone." "Like what?" "We always talked about traveling to Europe someday, but I don't know if that was something I wanted or something he wanted that I agreed to. We planned to buy a house in the suburbs eventually, but now I'm wondering if I actually prefer living in the city." She paused, looking thoughtful. "The therapist asked me to make a list of things I've always been curious about but never pursued. And you know what? The list was longer than I expected." "What's on it?" "Taking a photography class, learning to cook something besides pasta and sandwiches, maybe traveling somewhere alone just to see if I can navigate a new place by myself." She smiled. "Going back to school, possibly. I've always been interested in art history, but I chose graphic design because it seemed more practical." "Those all sound like good things to explore." "They do, but they also feel like betrayals somehow, like I'm abandoning the person I was when I was married to Michael. Or maybe you're discovering parts of yourself that were always there but didn't have space to develop." Rebecca considered this. "My therapist said something similar. She said that loving someone doesn't mean you have to stop growing as an individual." The restaurant was starting to empty out around us, and I realized we'd been talking for over 2 hours. Time had a way of disappearing when I was with Rebecca, which I was beginning to recognize as the mark of a good friendship. "Can I ask you something?" she said as we waited for the check. "Sure. Do you think it's possible for two people to help each other figure out who they are without it becoming romantic?" The question caught me off guard, not because I hadn't thought about it, but because I had. "Why do you ask?" "Because I value what we have, and I don't want to complicate it. But I also recognize that we're both single adults who enjoy each other's company, and people are going to make assumptions." "What kind of assumptions?" My sister has already asked if we're dating. David mentioned something to you about it, didn't he? I nodded. David had indeed made several pointed comments about my mysterious dinner companion, and seemed confused by my insistence that Rebecca and I were just friends. I think it's possible, I said finally. And I think what we have is valuable exactly because it's not complicated by romantic expectations. Good, Rebecca said, looking relieved. Because I'm not ready for that kind of complication. But I'm also not ready to lose this friendship. You won't lose it. The waiter brought our check, and as we split the bill, I realized that something had shifted in our dynamic. We'd moved beyond the tentative stage of new friendship into something more solid and dependable. Rebecca was becoming a real part of my life, someone I looked forward to seeing and whose perspective I'd come to value. But as we walked to our cars, I couldn't help wondering if maintaining the boundaries we'd established would be as simple as we both seemed to think it would be. December arrived with an unexpected snowstorm that left Portland looking like a postcard, but functioning like chaos. The city wasn't equipped for significant snow, and even a few inches could shut down public transportation and make driving treacherous. I was working from home on a Wednesday morning when Rebecca called, sounding frustrated and a little panicked. My car won't start, she said without preamble. I have a presentation this afternoon with a major client and I can't get there. The buses aren't running and every taxi service I've called is booked solid. Where's the meeting? Downtown, near Pioneer Square. I know it's a huge favor to ask, but do you think you could give me a ride? I'll pay for gas and buy you dinner and probably owe you for the rest of my life. I looked out my window at the snow that was still falling steadily. My Honda Civic wasn't exactly built for winter conditions, but it had front-wheel drive, and I'd driven in worse weather when I lived in Minnesota for college. Of course. When do you need to be there? 2 o'clock. But maybe we should leave extra time because of the roads? I'll pick you up at noon. That should give us plenty of buffer. When I arrived at Rebecca's house, I got my first real look at the place she'd shared with Michael. It was a craftsman-style bungalow in the Hawthorne district, with a small front porch and mature trees in the yard. Even covered in snow, you could see that someone had put care into the landscaping. Rebecca emerged wearing a professional-looking dress and carrying a portfolio case, picking her way carefully across the icy driveway. She looked nervous in a way I'd never seen before. "Thank you so much for doing this," she said as she got into the car. This client could make or break my freelance ambitions, and I couldn't bear the thought of rescheduling because of car trouble. Freelance ambitions? I haven't mentioned it before because I wasn't sure I'd go through with it, but I've been planning to leave my job and start my own design business. This presentation is for a non-profit that could become my first major independent client. The drive downtown took twice as long as usual, but we made good time considering the conditions. Rebecca spent most of the trip reviewing her presentation notes and practicing key points out loud. I could tell this meeting meant more to her than just a business opportunity. "Are you nervous about going freelance?" I asked as we crawled through traffic on Burnside. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also excited. Working for myself feels like one of those things I might have done years ago if I hadn't been so focused on financial security after Michael died." "What changed your mind?" "My therapist asked me what I'd regret not trying if I knew I only had 5 years left to live. Going freelance was at the top of the list." I dropped Rebecca off in front of the office building with 20 minutes to spare. She looked composed and professional despite the chaotic morning, and I found myself hoping the presentation would go well. "I'll call you when I'm done," she said, hopefully with good news. I spent the afternoon working from a coffee shop downtown, rather than attempting the drive home and back. Around 4 o'clock, my phone rang. "They said yes!" Rebecca's voice was bright with excitement. "Not only do they want to hire me, but they want me to design materials for 3 different programs. It's enough work to justify leaving my regular job." "That's amazing, congratulations. I'm buying you the most expensive dinner I can afford. Are you free tonight?" We ended up at a steakhouse that neither of us would normally splurge on, but Rebecca insisted on celebrating properly. She was more animated than I'd seen her since we'd become friends, talking rapidly about her business plans and the projects she was excited to work on. "I can't believe I almost let car trouble ruin this opportunity," she said over appetizers. "If you hadn't been able to drive me, I would have had to reschedule, and they might have hired someone else. You would have figured something out. You're more resourceful than you give yourself credit for." "Maybe. but it made me realize how isolated I've become. You're basically the only person I could think of to call for help. The comment struck me as both touching and concerning. What? About your sister? Or friends from work? My sister lives in Seattle, and my work friends are nice, but we're not close enough for emergency favors. Most of my real friends were couple friends that Michael and I had together, and those relationships got complicated after he died. Rebecca cut into her steak thoughtfully. It's weird how grief doesn't just take away the person you lost. It changes all your other relationships too. How so? Some people don't know how to act around you anymore, so they just disappear. Others become overly careful, like they're afraid you'll break down if they mention anything remotely sad, and the couple's friends. Well, it's awkward being the only single person in group situations. She took a sip of wine. Plus, there's this weird social pressure to start dating again so you can fit back into couple-oriented social circles. People mean well, but they don't understand that being single isn't necessarily a problem that needs solving. Do you miss having a larger social circle? Sometimes. But I also appreciate the simplicity of smaller, deeper friendships. Quality over quantity, you know? After dinner, I drove Rebecca home through streets that were still icy but passable. The snow had stopped falling, and the city looked beautiful under the streetlights, all soft edges and muffled sounds. Do you want to come in for coffee? She asked as I pulled into her driveway. I'd like to show you something, and it's too cold to keep you standing on the porch. Her house was exactly what I'd expected based on what I knew about Rebecca. Warm, carefully arranged, filled with books and artwork. But I was surprised by how many photos of Michael were still prominently displayed. They covered most of the mantel and several side tables, showing him at various ages and in different settings. This is what I wanted to show you, Rebecca said, leading me to a corner of the living room where an easel was set up. I started taking that photography class I mentioned. The easel held a black and white photograph of the same street corner taken at different times of day. The composition was striking, showing how light and shadow transformed the same architectural elements throughout the day. This is really good, I said, and I meant it. You have a good eye for composition. Thank you. It's been therapeutic, actually, learning to see familiar places in new ways. I looked around the room again, taking in the careful balance between preserving memories and creating space for new experiences. How do you think Michael would feel about you going freelance? Rebecca smiled. He'd be proud, but not surprised. He always said I was too talented to waste my creativity on marketing brochures for boring companies. Sounds like he knew you pretty well. He did. But I'm learning that knowing someone well and knowing yourself well aren't the same thing. As I got ready to leave, Rebecca walked me to the door. Thank you again for today. Not just for the ride, but for celebrating with me. It meant a lot to have someone to share the good news with. I'm glad it worked out. James? She said as I was putting on my coat. I know we agreed to keep things platonic, but I want you to know that you've become really important to me. Whatever this friendship is, I value it more than I can explain. The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. I value it too. Driving home through the snowy streets, I found myself thinking about the evening and what Rebecca had said about grief changing all your relationships. I realized that our friendship had become important to me in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged. She was someone I looked forward to seeing, someone whose opinion mattered to me, someone I wanted to share good news with. But I also recognized that the boundaries we'd established were becoming more complex to navigate. Tonight had felt different somehow. More intimate. More like something that could easily tip into romantic territory if we weren't careful. The question was whether being careful was what either of us really wanted anymore. 3 months later, on a warm March evening, Rebecca called me with unusual excitement in her voice. I have news, she said. Big news. Can you meet me at Morrison's? Same table where this all started. When I arrived at the coffee house, Rebecca was already there, practically glowing with anticipation. She'd cut her hair shorter and was wearing a dress I'd never seen before. Bright red, confident, completely different from the careful neutrals she usually favored. You look different, I said as I sat down. I feel different. James, I got accepted. Accepted to what? Graduate school, art history program at Portland State. I applied 3 months ago and just heard back today. I stared at her, processing this information she'd never mentioned. You applied to graduate school and didn't tell me? I didn't tell anyone. I was afraid if I said it out loud, I'd lose my nerve. She leaned forward, eyes bright. But I got in, and they're offering me a teaching assistantship that will cover tuition. Rebecca, that's incredible. When do you start? Fall semester, which means I have 6 months to wrap up my freelance projects and figure out how to be a student again at 43. She pulled out her phone and showed me the acceptance email, reading parts of it aloud like she still couldn't believe it was real. I never thought I'd do something this big on my own, she said. Michael always encouraged me, but he was also my safety net. Knowing he believed in me made taking risks easier. And now? Now I have to believe in myself, which is terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. We talked for 2 hours about her plans, her fears, what this change might mean for her life. As she spoke, I realized I was looking at a completely transformed person. The careful, controlled Rebecca I'd met 8 months ago had evolved into someone willing to take chances, to bet on herself. There's something else I need to tell you, she said as we prepared to leave. I've been seeing someone. The words hit me unexpectedly hard. Oh. His name is David. Not your David. A different David. He's a professor in the art department. We met when I was researching the graduate program. I tried to arrange my face into an appropriate expression of happiness for my friend, but apparently failed. James, she said gently, are you upset? No, I said too quickly. I mean, I'm happy for you. You deserve to find someone. Do I detect some jealousy there? The question hung between us. I could have deflected it, maintained the careful boundaries we'd constructed around our friendship. Instead, I found myself being honest. Maybe a little. Rebecca nodded slowly. I wondered if you might feel that way. I've been wondering about my own feelings, too. What do you mean? I mean that somewhere along the way, our friendship became something more complicated than either of us intended, at least for me. We stood outside Morrison's in the exact spot where I'd first asked her what she meant by being tired of just being a widow. The March air was soft with the promise of spring, and the street was busy with people enjoying the warmer weather. So, what happens now? I asked. I don't know, Rebecca said. But I know that meeting you changed something fundamental about how I see myself and what I want from life. You helped me remember that I'm not just Michael's widow. I'm Rebecca, and I have my own dreams and desires and future. She stepped closer. And part of that future includes taking emotional risks I wasn't ready for before. With the professor? Maybe. Or maybe with someone else who's been patient enough to let me figure myself out. The implication was clear, but so was the complexity of the situation. Rebecca was starting a new chapter of her life, one that included graduate school and possibly someone new. Where did that leave us? Rebecca, I said finally. I think I might be falling for you. I know, she said. I've been falling for you too. The question is whether we're brave enough to see where that leads. 6 months earlier, Rebecca had said she was tired of being just a widow at 42. Looking at her now, confident, excited about her future, willing to take chances on love and education and new experiences, I realized she'd succeeded in becoming something more. And maybe, just maybe, we were both finally ready to find out who we could become together. Yes, I said. I think we're that brave. She smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she'd been hoping I'd say exactly that. Good, she said. Because I was really hoping you'd say that. As we walked to our cars, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. We'd started as strangers in a book club, become friends over terrible diner coffee, and somehow evolved into something neither of us had been looking for, but both of us needed. Rebecca was right. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was a woman starting graduate school, building a business, taking photography classes, and opening herself up to love again. And I wasn't just the guy whose wife had left him. I was someone who'd learned to value friendship, take chances on new experiences, and maybe, finally, trust myself to love someone again. The future felt uncertain but full of possibility, which seemed like exactly the right place to begin. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.